Rain drummed relentlessly against the battered hull of Declan Kane's workshop, a symphony of nature's insistence clashing with the rhythmic hum of machinery inside. Declan, a human mechanic with grease-streaked hands and an eternal 5 o'clock shadow, leaned over a fragmented ion stabilizer, his brow furrowed in concentration. His workshop was more of a refuge than a business. Tucked away on the desolate edge of Azura Station, a floating outpost orbiting the resource-rich gas giant of Torvex 9. It smelled of ozone, oil, and the faint metallic tang of alien alloys. A cocktail he found oddly comforting. Declan wasn't the kind of man who sought out adventure. Life had dealt him a hand of modest ambitions. Fix things, get paid, and stay out of intergalactic politics. Yet, beneath his gruff demeanor and calloused hands lay a restless curiosity, a spark of something that even he wouldn't admit to himself. Perhaps that's why he'd ended up here, in the farthest reaches of civilized space, patching up freighters, drones, and the occasional luxury cruiser that dared venture this far from the core worlds. As he worked, the workshop's ancient AI assistant, a snarky relic named Vera, interrupted his focus. "Declan, you've got a visitor. And by visitor, I mean something that's emitting enough radiation to make a Geiger counter cry." He sighed, setting down his plasma torch. "What now?" "Another salvage with a death wish." "Not quite. Better see for yourself." The bay doors groaned open, revealing a small, alien spacecraft limping its way onto the landing pad. It was an elegant but battered thing, with curved wings like a bird of prey and a hull that shimmered faintly, as though the metal remembered how to glow but had forgotten the reason why. The ship's condition was dire. Scorch marks marred its surface, and one of its engines sputtered weakly, coughing out violet sparks. Declan stepped closer, squinting through the rain. The hatch hissed open, and a small figure emerged, an alien child, no taller than his hip. Its skin was a translucent shade of cerulean, with faint bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in rhythm with what he assumed was its heartbeat. Its large, liquid eyes glistened with a mix of fear and determination. "Help," the child said in broken standard, clutching a crystalline orb that glowed faintly. "Ship. Dying. Need fix." Declan crouched to meet its gaze, his voice softening. "Hey, kid, don't worry. We'll get you sorted. What's your name?" The child hesitated, then said, "Leah." He gave a reassuring nod. "All right, Leah. Let's see what we're working with." As Declan examined the ship, he realized it wasn't like anything he'd seen before. The design was distinctly alien, even by the galaxy's diverse standards. The circuitry pulsed like veins, and the engine core emitted a low hum that resonated in his chest. Whatever technology powered this thing was light years ahead of anything he'd worked on before, and that both thrilled and terrified him. "Where'd you come from, kid?" he asked, glancing at Leah. She pointed toward the star-speckled void. "Far. Bad people chase. Must go." Declan's gut tightened. He didn't need the details to know this was trouble. Big trouble. But there was something in the kid's eyes, a desperate vulnerability that reminded him of his younger sister, long gone now, lost to the same harsh universe that had made him the man he was today. "All right," he said, standing. "Let's get to work." For hours, Declan labored on the ship, deciphering its alien mechanics with equal parts ingenuity and educated guesswork. Leah watched silently, her glowing eyes tracking his every move. Occasionally, she would point to a component or gesture in a way that helped him piece together the puzzle. Despite the language barrier, their collaboration felt seamless, almost intuitive. The rain continued to fall, a steady backdrop to the symphony of clanging tools and hissing welds. As Declan worked, his mind wandered, grappling with the implications of what he was doing. If Leah's story was true, she was on the run from something, or someone. Helping her might put a target on his back. Azura Station was a backwater, but it wasn't invisible. And if there was one thing Declan had learned in his years out here, it was that no good deed went unpunished. "Why me, huh?" he muttered under his breath, tightening a valve. "Out of all the damn stations in the galaxy." "You are kind," Leah said softly, startling him. He glanced at her, surprised. "Kind? Nah, kid. Just stupid." But her words lingered, unsettling in their simplicity. Declan wasn't sure he believed her, but a part of him wanted to. As dawn broke over the station, the ship's repairs were nearly complete. Declan wiped his hands on a rag, exhaustion tugging at his every muscle. Leah stood nearby, cradling her glowing orb, her expression unreadable. "All right, she's good to go," he said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Should get you wherever you need to be." Leah's eyes shimmered with gratitude. "Thank you." Before Declan could respond, the workshop's proximity alarms blared. Vera's voice crackled to life, tinged with urgency. "Declan, we've got company. And not the friendly kind." Through the rain-soaked window, he saw them. 3 sleek, black ships descending toward the station. Their menacing silhouettes cut through the gray dawn like knives, their weapons bristling with lethal intent. Declan's stomach dropped. "Kid," he said, grabbing Leah by the shoulder. "Get on that ship and go. Now." "But—" "No buts. Go." Leah hesitated, then nodded, her small hands trembling as she climbed into the cockpit. The ship's engines roared to life, glowing with renewed vigor. As the alien craft lifted off, Declan stood in the doorway of his workshop, watching the black ships close in. His jaw tightened. He'd done the right thing. He had to believe that. But as the first blast rocked the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just painted a target on his own back. The black ships didn't hesitate. As Leah's craft streaked into the stormy sky, the invaders opened fire. Green plasma bolts ripped through the damp morning air, sizzling against the workshop's reinforced hull. Declan dove for cover behind a rusted workbench, cursing under his breath as shrapnel rained down around him. His ears rang, and the acrid stench of burning metal filled his nostrils. Vera's voice cut through the chaos, cold and efficient. "Shields at 20%. I'd recommend running, Declan." "Yeah. Thanks for the pep talk," he snapped, rolling to his feet. He dashed toward emergency hatch, a panel in the far wall barely used since he'd set up shop here. The walls shuddered as another barrage struck the building, and a support beam crashed to the floor, narrowly missing him. "Declan, incoming transmission," Vera announced, her tone oddly somber. From the lead ship. He froze, glancing at the monitor on the wall. The screen flickered to life, revealing a figure cloaked in shadow, their face obscured by a sleek, obsidian helmet. The voice that emerged was distorted, metallic, and cold. "Human, you are harboring a fugitive. Surrender the child, and you may yet walk away from this." Declan snorted, wiping a smear of grease from his cheek. "Sorry, pal. Kid's not here anymore. Guess you'll have to chase her yourselves." The figure tilted their heads slightly, as if considering his words. "Unfortunate. Then you are expendable." The transmission ended abruptly, and the assault resumed with renewed intensity. Declan's heart pounded as he sprinted for the hatch, adrenaline drowning out his exhaustion. He slapped the release button, and the panel slid open, revealing a narrow tunnel that led to the station's outer perimeter. Without looking back, he dove inside, the roar of collapsing walls echoing behind him. The tunnel spat him out into the open air, the rain now a torrential downpour. He stumbled to his feet, coughing and gasping. Ahead, the rugged landscape of Azure Station stretched out in muted grays and browns, a patchwork of rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. The black ships hovered ominously above the smoldering remains of his workshop, their searchlights slicing through the gloom. Declan ducked behind a boulder, trying to catch his breath. His mind raced, piecing together his next move. Leah was gone, hopefully far enough away by now. But those ships weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. And if they couldn't find her, they'd tear this station apart looking for clues. "Vera," he whispered, activating the portable comm unit strapped to his wrist. "You still online?" "Barely," the AI replied, her voice crackling with static. "What's the plan, boss?" "Stall them," he said, peering around the boulder. "Send a signal to the station's automated defenses. Maybe we can buy some time. Defenses are offline," Vera said. "Have been for months. You know, because someone refused to pay for maintenance." "Not the time for lectures, Vera," he growled. "What about the comm relay? Can we broadcast a distress signal?" "That might work," she admitted. "But it'll take time to override the security protocols." Declan sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Do it. And make it fast." "On it," Vera said. "But you'll need to keep them distracted." He glanced at the improvised satchel he grabbed before escaping the workshop. Inside were a few essential tools, a couple of EMP grenades he'd cobbled together from scrap, and a single, outdated plasma pistol with a half-drained power cell. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Distract them, huh?" he muttered. "Great. No problem." The first grenade went off with a satisfying crackle, the electromagnetic pulse shorting out one of the black ship's searchlights. Declan darted from cover to cover, using the confusion to his advantage. Plasma bolts rained down around him, scorching the ground and sending up plumes of steam. His heart hammered in his chest, each step a gamble with death. "Vera, how's that signal coming?" he panted, ducking behind a jagged outcrop. 80% complete," she replied. "You might want to pick up the pace. They're triangulating your position." "Yeah, I noticed," he muttered, firing a shot from his pistol. The plasma bolt struck one of the ship's undercarriages, leaving a scorched mark but little else. He grimaced. "This is a terrible plan." "You came up with it," Vera reminded him. Before he could retort, a deafening roar filled the air. Declan looked up to see one of the ships descending rapidly, its weapons charging for a final strike. He braced himself, clutching the last grenade tightly. Then, a new sound joined the cacophony, the distant whine of approaching engines. Declan's heart leapt as a squadron of sleek, silver ships emerged from the clouds, their weapons blazing. The black ships broke formation, scattering like startled predators. "Distress signal received," Vera said triumphantly. "Looks like someone's got your back." Declan watched as the silver ships engaged the enemy, their coordinated assault turning the tide of the battle. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. He knew this wasn't over. Whoever was after Liao wouldn't give up so easily. "Let's hope they're friendlier than the last guys," he muttered, rising to his feet. The rain continued to fall, washing away the soot and grime, but not the weight of what lay ahead. The silver ships descended in a perfect arc, their sleek forms cutting through the rain and mist like blades. Declan squinted against the glow of their thrusters as they hovered above the scorched ground, their engines humming with an almost musical resonance. As the lead ship touched down, its landing gear extending with mechanical precision, Declan's fingers twitched toward his pistol. He wasn't about to assume anyone's good intentions this far out in the galaxy. The hatch of the lead ship opened, releasing a rush of pressurized air. A figure emerged, clad in a sleek, silver and white uniform that shimmered faintly under the dim light. They were tall, humanoid, but distinctly alien, their elongated limbs and pale, iridescent skin marking them as members of the Zephyrin race. Their eyes, a vivid shade of violet, locked onto Declan with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "You're Declan Kane," the Zephyrin said, their voice smooth and accented with a musical cadence. It wasn't a question. Declan straightened, his grip on the pistol tightening. "Who's asking?" The Zephyrin raised a slender hand, palm outward, in what seemed to be a gesture of peace. "My name is Commander Aeliravin. We received your distress signal." You appear to have attracted some unwanted attention. No kidding, Declan muttered, glancing at the sky. The black ships had vanished for now, but he doubted they'd stay gone for long. What's a Zephyrin fleet doing this far out, anyway? Thought your kind stuck to the core worlds. Aelira's expression remained neutral, though there was a flicker of something, amusement maybe, in her eyes. We have our reasons. More importantly, we intercepted a signal matching an ancient frequency. One tied to certain artifacts. Her gaze shifted to Declan's wrist, where the portable comm unit glowed faintly. Artifacts that should not be in the hands of those who would misuse them. Declan frowned, following her gaze. This, he said, raising the device. It's just a comm unit. Build it myself. Perhaps, Aelira said, her tone non-committal. But the signal originated from this location. And not long after, we detected a ship fleeing the area. A ship powered by technology that has not been seen in this galaxy for centuries. Declan's stomach tightened. You're talking about Leah's ship. Aelira's violet eyes sharpened. Leah, the fugitive child. She's not a fugitive, Declan snapped. She's a kid, scared out of her mind and running from people who want her dead. Aelira stepped closer, her presence both commanding and unnervingly calm. And what do you know of her, Declan Kane? Of the orb she carries? Of the power it holds? Declan hesitated, the weight of her questions settling heavily on him. The truth was he didn't know much. Leah had been tight-lipped about the details, and he hadn't pressed her. But now, standing face-to-face with a Zephyrin commander who clearly knew more than she was letting on, he realized just how deep he might be in. I know she needs help, he said finally. And I know I'm not about to hand her over to the first group of armed strangers who come knocking. Aelira's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. Then, she tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging his resolve. You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Kane. I've been called worse, he said dryly. Before Aelira could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Commander, a Zephyrin officer, called from the lead ship. We've detected residual energy signatures matching the orb's frequency. They're faint, but they lead toward the outer rim of the station. Aelira's expression hardened. Then we've no time to waste. She turned back to Declan. If you're truly intent on protecting the child, you'd best come with us. The ones pursuing her won't stop, and they won't care who gets in their way. Declan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to cut and run, to vanish into the fringes of the galaxy where no one would bother looking for a washed-up mechanic. But then he thought of Leah, her wide, terrified eyes, and the trust she'd placed in him despite having every reason not to. All right, he said, holstering his pistol. But I'm not signing up for any suicide missions. Just so we're clear. Aelira allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Understood. As the silver ships lifted off, carrying Declan and the Zephyrin team toward the outer rim of the station, the rain began to let up, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and charred metal. Declan stared out the viewport, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Who exactly were the Zephyrins? What was the orb Leah carried? And most importantly, how had he, a backwater mechanic with no stake in galactic politics, become tangled in something so far beyond his understanding? He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. Whatever lay ahead, it wasn't going to be simple. And if he wanted to keep Leah safe, he'd need to figure out the truth, fast. The outskirts of Azure Station were a wasteland of jagged rock formations and abandoned mining rigs, remnants of a boom era long gone. The Zephyrin ships navigated the terrain with ease, their engines emitting a low, harmonic hum that reverberated through the cavernous cliffs. Declan leaned against the cold metal of the observation deck, watching the world blur past below. The unease in his chest grew heavier with every mile. You're quiet, Aelira said, stepping up beside him. Her violet eyes were sharper now, more focused, as if she'd put aside whatever diplomacy she'd been attempting earlier. What's on your mind? He folded his arms, debating how much to reveal. Just trying to figure out what I've gotten myself into. One day, I'm fixing freighters for a living. The next, I'm dodging plasma fire and hitching rides with aliens who think I know more than I do. Alira tilted her head slightly, studying him. You've done more than most would in your position. It's not every day someone risks their life for a stranger. Yeah, well, that stranger's a kid, Declan said, his tone sharper than he intended. What kind of person just stands by? You'd be surprised, Alira replied softly. There was something in her voice, a note of experience, of knowing, that made him glance at her. But her face was a mask, betraying nothing more. She gestured toward the viewport. Look. Declan followed her gaze. Ahead, nestled in the shadow of a massive cliff, was an ancient structure. Its spires jutted into the sky like skeletal fingers, weathered by time, but still imposing. Symbols etched into its surface glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that felt alive. What is that? He asked, the unease in his chest tightening into something sharper. A vault, Alira said. One of the few left from the architects. We believe Leah's orb is connected to these places. And if we're right, this vault might hold the answers we need. The architects, Declan repeated. He'd heard the name before, whispered in tales and conspiracy theories. They were said to be an ancient race, long extinct, who'd left behind relics of incredible power. Relics that some claimed had the power to shape worlds or destroy them. You think that kid's carrying something from them? He asked, skeptical. Alira nodded. The energy signature from her ship matches what we've recorded from other architect relics. If the orb is what we suspect, then it's no wonder she's being hunted. Whoever controls that kind of power controls everything, Declan finished grimly. Alira didn't respond, but the set of her jaw told him he was right. The ship began its descent, the hum of the engines shifting in pitch as they approached the ground. Declan felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. The air near the vault was thick and still, carrying the faint scent of ozone. The Zephyrin team moved with practiced precision, their weapons at the ready, as they formed a perimeter around the structure. Declan followed Alira toward the main entrance, his pulse quickening with every step. Are you sure this is a good idea? He asked. Walking into an ancient alien vault doesn't exactly scream safe. It's not, Alira admitted, but it's necessary. She stopped in front of the massive doors, her fingers brushing over the glowing symbols. They flared brighter at her touch, the patterns shifting like liquid light. Besides, we're not walking in blind. Declan raised an eyebrow. You've done this before. Alira's lips twitched into a faint smile. Let's just say I've read the manual. Before he could press her further, the ground trembled beneath them. The doors groaned as they began to part, revealing a dark, yawning passageway that seemed to stretch on forever. Alira motioned for the team to follow, her expression hardening. Stay close, she said. And don't touch anything. Declan swallowed hard, gripping the strap of his satchel as they stepped inside. The air was cool and heavy, and the faint hum of the glowing symbols seemed to vibrate in his bones. The walls were lined with intricate carvings, their meanings lost to time, but their craftsmanship undeniable. It felt less like a place and more like a presence, watching them, waiting. So, Declan began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. What happens if we find what we're looking for? Alira didn't look back as she answered. That depends on what it is. The answer didn't do much to ease his nerves. As they ventured deeper, the passage widened into a massive chamber. At its center stood a pedestal, bathed in a soft, otherworldly glow. On it rested a sphere, its surface swirling with colors that seemed to defy the spectrum. Declan's breath caught. Is that an architect relic? Alira confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. She approached it cautiously, her team fanning out to secure the perimeter. This must be what Leah's orb was signaling. It's a key. A key to what? Declan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Aelira didn't reply. Her focus was entirely on the relic, her fingers hovering just above its surface. The air seemed to thrum with energy, the glow intensifying as if responding to her presence. Then, as her fingers made contact, the entire chamber lit up with blinding light. Declan stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When the light faded, the carvings on the walls had changed, their patterns now moving in rhythmic, deliberate sequences. And from somewhere deep within the vault, a low, resonant tone echoed, growing louder by the second. "What did you do?" Declan demanded, his voice tinged with panic. Aelira's expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the glowing sphere. "I think," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising hum, "we just unlocked it." The vault trembled violently, dust cascading from the ancient stone ceiling as the resonant tone grew deeper and more insistent. Declan's ears rang, his instinct screaming at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted to the ground. His gaze flicked to Aelira, who stood transfixed before the glowing sphere, her hands now clasped tightly around it. The light from the sphere pulsed in tandem with the rhythmic carvings on the walls, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. "Aelira, what's happening?" Declan shouted over the deafening hum. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "The vault systems are activating. The relic, it's responding to something, or someone. Someone." Declan repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. But before he could press her further, the ground beneath them shifted, tilting violently to one side. Declan stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing as the chamber's floor split open, revealing a network of glowing conduits snaking beneath. The Zephyrin soldiers shouted commands, their voices drowned out by the cacophony. One of them, a younger officer with a scar across his cheek, grabbed Declan by the arm. "We have to get out of here. Now." "Wait." Declan protested, jerking his arm free. He pointed toward Aelira, who remained steadfast by the pedestal, the sphere's glow now enveloping her entirely. "We can't leave her. She knows what she's doing," the officer barked. "You don't. Move." Before Declan could argue, the chamber was flooded with a sudden burst of light, so intense it felt like staring into a star. He threw up his hands, shielding his eyes, as the hum escalated to a piercing shriek. And then, silence. When Declan opened his eyes, the glow had dimmed. The vault was still. The Zephyrin soldiers were frozen in place, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. At the center of the chamber, Aelira stood, but she was no longer holding the sphere. It floated before her, suspended in midair, its surface now etched with intricate patterns that seemed to ripple and shift like living things. "Aelira," Declan said cautiously, taking a tentative step toward her. "Are you okay?" She turned to him slowly, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "The architects left more than relics," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "They left their will, their intent. And now, it's awake." Declan's stomach churned. "What does that mean?" Before Aelira could answer, the chamber rumbled again, but this time the vibrations were accompanied by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It spoke in a language Declan didn't understand, yet its tone carried an undeniable weight, as if the words were pressing against his very soul. Aelira closed her eyes, her lips moving silently, as if in response. The Zephyrin soldiers exchanged nervous glances, their hands tightening on their weapons. Declan felt utterly out of his depth, his pulse pounding in his ears, as he turned to Aelira. "What's it saying?" he demanded. She opened her eyes, her gaze heavy with something he couldn't quite place. "It's asking a question," she said softly. It wants to know if we are worthy. Declan's throat went dry. Worthy of what? Aelira didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, the light from the sphere intensifying as she approached it. The carvings on the walls began to shift again, their patterns rearranging into symbols that Declan could almost, but not quite, recognize. Aelira reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the sphere once more. The voice returned, louder this time, its tone growing harsher, almost accusatory. Declan winced, clutching his head as the pressure in the room became almost unbearable. The soldiers began to back away, but Aelira stood firm, her expression resolute. "It's testing us," she said through gritted teeth. "Our intentions, our resolve. If we fail," she didn't need to finish the sentence. The ominous vibrations in the air were enough to convey the stakes. Declan took a shaky step forward, his instincts screaming at him to retreat, but his conscience refusing to let him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the din. Aelira glanced at him, her glowing eyes meeting his. "We prove ourselves. And how the hell do we do that?" Her gaze shifted back to the sphere. By answering its question. The chamber fell deathly silent once more, the voice fading into a low hum. Declan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. What could he possibly say to an ancient artifact, something so far beyond his understanding that it might as well have been magic? Before he could spiral further, Aelira spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "We seek to protect, not to conquer. To understand, not to exploit. That is our answer." The sphere pulsed, its glow expanding outward in a wave that washed over the chamber. The pressure in the air lifted, and the carvings on the walls stilled, their light dimming to a soft, steady glow. The voice spoke one final time, its tone almost approving. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the light from the sphere faded. It floated gently back onto the pedestal, its surface now dark and inert. Aelira staggered back, catching herself against the edge of the pedestal as the soldiers rushed to her side. "Did it work?" Declan asked, his voice hoarse. Aelira nodded slowly, her breathing ragged. "Accepted our answer." Declan exhaled a shaky breath, the weight of the moment finally hitting him. But before he could fully process what had just happened, a sharp, metallic clang echoed through the chamber. He spun around, his heart sinking as he saw the source of the noise. The outer doors had begun to close, their massive panels grinding into place with agonizing slowness. And beyond them, in the distance, the faint but unmistakable silhouette of enemy ships was approaching fast. The vault's doors slammed shut with a thunderous echo, sealing the team inside as the tremors beneath their feet grew more pronounced. Declan turned to Aelira, his voice tight with urgency. "Those ships are coming for us. How do we get out of here?" Aelira steadied herself, still visibly drained from her interaction with the relic. "The vault has defenses," she said, her voice strained but resolute. "If we can activate them, they might buy us enough time to escape." "How?" Declan asked, his gaze darting to the darkened sphere on the pedestal. "That thing doesn't look like it's in a hurry to help." "It's not about the sphere anymore," Aelira replied, gesturing to the glowing conduits beneath the floor. "The vault itself is alive. It's waiting for us to make the next move." Declan's stomach churned. Great. No pressure. Then the Zephyrin soldiers spread out, their weapons raised as the tremors intensified. The distant sound of the enemy fleet's engines was growing louder, a menacing hum that reverberated through the chamber. Declan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the knowledge that their survival depended on choices he barely understood. Aelira approached the central pedestal, her movements deliberate despite her obvious fatigue. "The relic accepted our answer," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "That means it trusts us to protect what's here." But trust goes both ways. What are you saying? Declan asked, his throat dry. I'm saying we need to give it something in return, she said, her eyes meeting his. Something that proves we're willing to sacrifice for the greater good. Declan's heart sank. You can't mean. Before she could respond, the chamber shook violently, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, sending debris crashing to the floor. One of the soldiers shouted a warning as the sound of enemy plasma fire echoed outside the vault. The ships had arrived. We're out of time, the scarred officer yelled. We need a plan now. Aelira turned back to the pedestal, her expression hardening. There is no time for debate, she said, placing her hands on the glowing surface. Declan, you've come this far. Do you trust me? Declan hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about everything he'd been through. The chaos, the uncertainty, the moments where he'd wanted nothing more than to walk away. And yet, here he was, standing in the heart of an ancient vault, alongside people who had trusted him in return. He took a deep breath. I trust you. Aelira nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. She closed her eyes, and the light from the conduit surged, filling the chamber with a blinding brilliance. The carvings on the walls began to shift again, their patterns coalescing into a massive, intricate symbol that pulsed with energy. The voice of the vault returned, its tone no longer harsh, but resonant and clear. It spoke a single word, one that Declan didn't understand, but felt in his very core: unity. A wave of energy radiated outward, passing through the walls and into the air beyond. The approaching ships faltered, their engines sputtering as the energy disrupted their systems. Outside, the enemy fleet hung suspended, their weapons powered down, their movements sluggish and erratic. Inside the chamber, the sphere on the pedestal began to glow once more. This time, its light was warm and steady, and Aelira stepped back, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The vault's defenses are active, she said, but it won't hold them forever. So what now? Declan asked, his voice trembling. Aelira looked at him, her expression softening. Now we leave, and we make sure this knowledge doesn't fall into the wrong hands. The team emerged from the vault into a landscape transformed. The enemy fleet's ships were grounded, their engines disabled by the vault's energy wave. Zephyrin reinforcements were already on the horizon, their sleek ships cutting through the sky with precision. Declan watched as the soldiers coordinated their extraction, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He turned to Aelira, who stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. You think it'll be enough? He asked quietly. She didn't answer right away, her expression contemplative. The architects left us their legacy, she said finally. It's up to us to prove we're worthy of it. Declan nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. What he did know was that he'd found something here, a purpose, a connection, that he hadn't even realized he was searching for. As the Zephyrin ships prepared to depart, Aelira turned to him, a faint smile playing on her lips. You did well, Declan. Better than most. He chuckled, though it came out more as a breath. High praise from a glowing-eyed alien. She laughed softly, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. As the ships ascended, the vault's massive doors closed once more, its secrets safely locked away. Declan leaned back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. For the first time, in what felt like days, he allowed himself to relax. The stars stretched out before them, endless and full of possibility. And for the first time, Declan felt ready to face whatever lay ahead.